Okay, Willow family, let's talk about it. Let's get into trauma and depression. Last week, we talked about chronic anxiety, the number one anxiety that every human carries in the workplace and the home place. But trauma and depression, I think every one of us have people we love in our lives who are carrying trauma or fighting depression. But of course, not all of us carry trauma and depression ourselves. I am a pastor, I'm not a clinician, but I work with a lot of people in my field who carry trauma, who battle depression. I also have loved ones in my own life, like many of you do as well. And I have the incredible benefit of being married to a trauma therapist. My wife, Lisa, is a trauma therapist, and oftentimes we do work together. So a lot of what I've learned about it is by listening to the stories of people with trauma and also being trained by my wife on this. Let's talk about these one at a time. Let's start with trauma. Trauma is quite simply something terrible that actually happened to you in your past, and it now lives in two places. It lives in your body, and it lives in your future. This is the cruel aspect of trauma, is even though it happened in your past, you made meaning about what happened, and that meaning now resides by triggering your body. So oftentimes, those of you who are carrying some kind of a traumatic incident, you think you've locked that trauma in a box deep down, but actually it keeps showing up physiologically, and it keeps showing up in your future. And so this past event, what's fascinating about it is, let's take something common in trauma that's safe to talk about without triggering some of you. Let's talk about a car accident. Two people can have the same car accident, and one becomes fine. They just walk away and they say, that was weird, and they get along with their life. But the other one is stuck. And the reason they're stuck in their trauma and triggered is because the meaning they've made out of the car accident as it relates to safety in the future is what lodges deep and triggers their body. And so then anytime they get into a car, maybe they have a physiological reaction. The other challenge with trauma is it acts a little bit like a sleeper cell. I've worked with military veterans who have actually seen combat, maybe in Afghanistan or Iraq. They come home and they say, I'm fine. But then 3 years later or 5 years later, their life completely unravels. That's because trauma was in their body and it activated after a while, kind of like a sleeper cell does. So, a few things to know about trauma. First of all, a lot of people who are carrying trauma are wanting to graduate from it as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, that's not the way it works. I wish that you could work on your trauma and be done with it for the rest of your life. Now, I'm not saying that if you are carrying trauma, that you need to be in therapy for the rest of your life. But I am saying that for the rest of your life, you will probably need to be in seasons of therapy. It's helpful to think about trauma more like taking your vitamins or going to the gym. Maybe you don't do it every day, maybe not all the time, but for the rest of your life, you will probably need to work on it because it's less something that you graduate from and more something that you manage, that activates and recedes and activates and recedes. One of the things we help people with trauma think about is that their life has shock absorbers in it. And what your trauma does is it wears down your capacity to manage the bumps in your life. So if you find yourself getting more easily tripped up, if you find yourself self-medicating in unhelpful ways or moving into secret habits, these might be signs that your shock absorbers are worn and it's time to get into therapy. I've also talked to a lot of people in trauma who say, look, I've tried therapy and it didn't work. Let me say this. My wife became a therapist and then she became a trauma-trained therapist and it changed everything. So if you have not gone to a trauma-trained therapist, I would highly encourage that you find one. Willow Creek has resources where this church can help you find trauma-trained therapists. We're talking things like EMDR, therapists that are trained to safely help get your trauma out of that lockbox you have it in, but also they're trained to help you with your brain function so you're able to more remember your trauma without reliving it. It's really worth it. Okay, let's talk about clinical depression. Now we're in the field of mental health medication. And again, of course, I'm not a clinician. This requires somebody with a medical degree. Here's what I would like to say about depression or bipolar disorder or the variety of mental health needs that really benefit from medication. Let me say this as a pastor. Number one, if you need mental health medication, you should take mental health medication, and thank God that we live in the 21st century where science and we can love God with our minds and create chemicals that can really help our brain. Number two, mental health medication is not a comment on your faith. It is a comment on your chemicals. It's more about the way your chemicals are than your belief in God. I have many people in my life that require mental health medication to face the day. They are people of profound faith, perhaps even deeper faith than I have because of the ways they have to depend on God. So there's no Christian shame in taking mental health medication if you need it. Please take it. Please thank God for it. The second thing I'll say about that is just the way I'm wired. I wake up happy most days. And that's not my fault that I wake up happy most days. Again, for those of you who are football fans, I wake up on first and goal most days, in sight of a touchdown. People who require mental health medication, they wake up at the wrong end zone. They wake up at threat of scoring a safety. The defense is blitzing them, and mental health medication, it does not get them all the way to the end zone I'm in, but it does give them a more fighting chance. And the fact that they wake up that way is not automatically their fault. So if you struggle with depression, if you struggle with bipolar disorder, if you struggle with paranoid schizophrenia, some of these really difficult disorders, it may not be your fault. It is not a comment on your faith, and you are worth all of the fighting involved. Let's just talk about depression. Maybe you have a loved one that battles depression. Maybe they're even on mental health medication. It's difficult, isn't it? In some ways, depression is a team sport. If that person is in your household, everyone is playing along, and it can wear everybody out, of course, including the person who's fighting the depression. The number one challenge is the way depression affects the nervous system. It just removes your motivation toward impulse, toward action. Depression kind of exchanges that motivation for motivation to not move. Just an incredible lethargy. Very difficult to face the day. Making decisions becomes very difficult. Oftentimes, depression can show up like an overwhelming numbness or an incredible feeling of not just a black hole, but falling into that hole. And so what a lot of people who battle depression do is they just try to stay where they are so they don't fall into the hole. Now, if we're going to talk about depression, that means that we do have to talk about suicide. A couple of things on suicide. If you yourself are struggling with suicidal thoughts, it is so important that you talk about it. This whole series is called Let's Talk About It, and there might never be a more important time than for you to talk about your suicidal thoughts. There is no shame that you're thinking it, and it may not be your fault that you're thinking it. So if you could remove the moral judgment, because the problem with suicide is its temptation is two things. Number one, its temptation is to say, just end your life. It'll be a relief for you. It'll be a relief for others. And that's not true. There's no relief for anybody in suicide. So for some people, the challenge with suicide is it puts you in a euphoria, a false sense of relief that you almost feel a euphoria because it is so hard for you to face the day. Please, would you reach out? Willow Creek has resources and will help you. And again, much like trauma, maybe you've gotten help before, but there's still more help for you to have. The cruel aspect of depression is sometimes medication works and then suddenly it stops working and you need to change medication or try a different path. But you are worth the effort. You are worth love. You're worth receiving love. Now, finally, a word to those of us who maybe have loved ones or people in our life who express suicidal thoughts to us. This can make you really anxious, can't it? Like if somebody, maybe a child or somebody in your workplace shares their suicidal thoughts, they take what I just said seriously and they say, okay, I want you to know I'm having these thoughts. And suddenly you're saying, what do I do? I'm an amateur. Well, of course, get that person professional help. Call the church. The church has pastors that can help connect to licensed professionals. But there's a lot that you can do as an amateur. Number one, take a deep breath. It's okay. God is with you and God is with this person. But number two, picture the conversation you have with a suicidal person like scuba diving. So let's say this is the person and this is you, and the person says, I'm feeling suicidal. That's them going deeper in the water. What you attempted to do is to try to not talk about it. That's you going shallower to the surface. But what is most helpful for them is to match them and then go deeper down. So if they say, I have suicidal thoughts, do the counterintuitive move of asking curious questions. Get into it. What kinds of thoughts are you having? Now you're deeper. And if they go and say, you know what, don't worry about it, it's fine, they're going shallower, that might be a sign that you can get them help, but nothing's imminent. But if they match you or go deeper and then tell you their thoughts and their graphic suicidal thoughts, you know to take it seriously. So then go deeper again, ask another curious question. If you were to kill yourself, how would you do it? What's your plan? And if they go shallower and say, oh, I've not even thought about how to do it, then you know, okay, we're not in imminent danger. We don't have to call 911. But if they give you a plan, you know. So as you ask questions that go into their suicide, you can measure, are they taking me to the surface? Are they taking me deeper? Now, this can be terrifying. It is terrifying. But here's the thing. They're already thinking about it, and you're not putting thoughts in their head by asking questions. You are communicating to them, I see you, I take you seriously, I care about you. So you can ask them anything. You can get graphic, so long as you're curious and asking them to tell you. And what you're doing is mirroring for them so that they see in you that you are taking it as seriously or more seriously than they are. And as they bring it to the surface, it shows you, okay, this is not an imminent threat, but yes, we are going to get you help. I remember it used to be when you went through airport security, there'd be a sign that said, making a joke about having a bomb is just as serious as having a bomb. We will arrest you for joking about it. Suicide's kind of the same way. When somebody says they're suicidal, we say, hey, we take all of these seriously. Let's get you help. That doesn't mean you have to call the police, but you should call the church and get this person some help they need. Okay, I know this was a really intense session, but it's so important to talk about it, isn't it? And so if you're carrying these things, we encourage you to talk about it in your community. Reach out to the church if you don't have someone to talk about it. And I promise you, it's an incredible battle. It takes incredible bravery, but God is with you and you're worth it. See you next week.